Hey there, I'm Sam Dunn, and welcome to Overkill Rewind, the show where you get to pick the best metal albums of a certain year, and we get to review them. How fun is that? This time, we're going back 30 years to 1988. Maybe one of the best years ever in the history of metal. But before I get started, please make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on anything that we're up to at BangerTV. But before we get into the top metal albums of 1988, let's check in on what was going on in the culture at large. Rain Man and Who Framed Roger Rabbit were the two big box office hits that year. Who could forget the infamous Milli Vanilli scandal? And for better or worse, Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up was a charting pop single. But also of note, there was a lot of quote-unquote pop metal on the chart in '88. I'm talking about Aerosmith, Guns N' Roses, Def Leppard, and Whitesnake. But enough of that. Let's get to the real metal. Before I get into the top 5 metal albums of 1988, let me remind you of the process. These were the 5 albums that you chose. You voted on. I'm simply the messenger, so please don't shoot me. But starting at number 5, Queensrÿche, Operation Mindcrime.
It just takes a minute and you'll feel no pain. Gotta make something of your life, but give me one more thing. You've come to see the doctor, 'cause I'll show you the cure. I'm gonna take away the questions, yeah. I'm gonna make you sure, yeah.
Now let me be straight up. This is the one record of the top 5 that you chose that I am the least familiar with. Queensrÿche, of course, was on my radar back in the 80s, but was never one of my favorite metal bands. But after revisiting this album 30 years later, I gotta say, the production on this album really stands up. Of course, behind this we had Peter Collins and Paul Northfield, who for many years had worked with Rush. And speaking of Rush, the other thing that really stands out about Operation Mindcrime is we're really hearing the seeds of prog metal here. And it really feels like Rush with a layer of metal. And a really ambitious concept album. And what can you say about Jeff Tate's voice? If you love those soaring, operatic style of metal vocals, it's hard to beat this performance. Confession number 2, when I went back and listened to these top 5 albums as voted by you, I found the whole skull rating thing to be futile. We are talking about 5 of the best metal albums that have ever been made. So in a way, I guess they're all 5 out of 5. Let's go to the next one. Coming in at number 4, the almighty Slayer, South of Heaven.
Second coming arise. Before you see the light, you must die.
1988, South of Heaven, the second album produced by Rick Rubin for Slayer, coming on the heels of arguably the best extreme metal album of all time, Rain in Blood. South of Heaven got a bit of a bad rap precisely because it followed on the heels of Rain in Blood. But I think if you look at this album in and of itself, we're talking about some of the best Slayer tunes that have ever been scribed. Of course, I'm talking about the title track, South of Heaven, and Mandatory Suicide, 2 songs that still feature prominently in Slayer's set. But I'm here to make a case for the beginning song of side 2, remember when there were sides? Ghosts of War, one of the least appreciated Slayer songs of all time in my humble opinion. My only criticism, and I thought I'd never say this, is Lombardo's bass drums might be a little too loud. Don't strike me down for saying that. Anyway, I was a bit worried there that you guys may have left this one out of the pack, but good job. South of Heaven is still mighty 30 years later. Let's go to number 3. That, of course, is the band Death off the album Leprosy. This is actually my own personal piece of vinyl, and I'm willing to reveal for the first time ever You'll note that there's a promotional stamp on it. Why? Because I stole it from my university radio station when I was 16. Why? Because I figured Death Leprosy was safer in my hands than in the university record library hands, and I think this is proof that it is. What is there to say about Death Leprosy? Well, many would argue that it's one of the foundational albums of extreme metal, and of course it was Death's second album and probably the last purely death metal record from the band, because by the time they got to Spiritual Healing and Human, they had moved into their more proggy sound. But listening to it now, you know, they've learned how to produce extreme metal a little better than back in 1988, but man, these tracks, Open Casket, Left to Die, Pull the Plug, and the title track, Leprosy, makes me want to be 14 all over again. So thanks, guys, for that. The second best metal album of 1988, as voted by you, the viewers of BangerTV, comes from one of the biggest metal bands on the planet.
Here they stand, brothers them all the sons, divided they fall. Here awaits the birth of the Son, the seventh, the heavenly, the chosen one.
Here, of course, we're talking about Iron Maiden's seventh son of a seventh son, and I guess it's really no surprise. Listening to this album 30 years later, what really stands out to me, of course, is the introduction of keyboards into the band's sound. They were dabbling in a little bass synth on Somewhere in Time, an album previous, but here we get these really big choral, classical interludes with big keyboard support. Also, what's noteworthy here is that it's an album that features a few tracks that may have jumped the shark a little for the die-hard Iron Maiden fan base. I'm talking about Can I Play With Madness, of course, which was a big video track, and I think really Seventh Son was the last album in what many consider to be the classic Maiden album period, which arguably starts with Killers or Number of the Beast. Listening to it now feels a little bit clean. I'm a fan of the earlier stuff myself, but there's some strong songs here. Moonchild, the title track, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, is still a classic, and really there's no list of metal albums that's complete without Maiden. So all in all, solid choice, guys. And so here we are, we made it to the top metal album of 1988 as voted by you. And if it didn't come from Iron Maiden, it could only come from this band.
All the justice, painted green, money talking. Power wolves, beasts at your door, hear them knocking. Soon you'll please their appetite, they devour. Hammer of justice crushes you, overpower. The ultimate vanity, exploiting their supremacy.
Coming in at number 1 is Metallica's And Justice for All. This, of course, is Metallica's 4th album, coming on the heels of Master of Puppets, and is the predecessor to their massive smash record, The Black Album. Now, And Justice for All is a complicated record for most Metallica fans. 1, because Master of Puppets was so beloved, and 2, the band really shifted their sound on this album, and I'm certainly not the first person to talk about it. It's generally regarded as being their prog record. We're talking very long songs. A lot of the songs are not pure thrashers like we'd seen on the first 3 records, and perhaps most talked about of all is the production. There's no bass, and I'm not sure about that drum sound. I suggest going to check out And Justice for Jason if you want to hear this album with a little bit of balls to it. Anyway, the song One was of course Metallica's first video. They had famously held out and said they didn't want to sell out and do videos prior to this one, but let's all admit it, we loved that video, and it is a song that has been part of the Metallica set since that record. Not a lot of the other songs have been in there. I mean, Harvester of Sorrow, Shortest Straw, and Blackened have made appearances over the course of the band's career, but this is not an album that's been celebrated as much as their earlier ones, and of course the Black Album. Now, I'm not sure if And Justice for All is a classic within the Metallica catalog, but if we take a look at the year 1988, it is undoubtedly a very important metal album. Not one of my favorites of 1988, but it's not about me. It's about you guys, and you voted it number 1. Now, I do want to add a few honorable mentions. These got a lot of votes from you guys, but not quite enough to crack the top 5. We've got Bathory, Blood, Fire, Death, Testament, New Order, Voivod, Dementor and Hatros, King Diamond, Them, and Halloween, Keeper of the Seven Keys. And I've got to add a few of my own: Violence, Eternal Nightmare, Pestilence, Malleus Maleficarum. We've got Carcass, Reek of Putrefaction, Forbidden, Forbidden Evil, and Nuclear Assault, Survive. But I'll stop there. I think that's proof. 1988, one of the best years in metal. We'll see you next time on Overkill Rewind.
All the dust